Well, good evening, everyone. Many thanks for joining today's virtual conversation on how to handle marketing in the middle of a pandemic. This event is brought to you by the Kellogg Alumni Club of Los Angeles in close collaboration with the LA MBA Group, a consortium of large group of business school alums. The event is was coordinated with, she originated the idea, and it panned out really well. Thank you, Cindy, for introducing Gordon. And we got Professor Calkins on board as well. Professor Tim Calkins and recent Princess Cruises CMO, Gordon Ho, have a power-packed presentation and discussion lined up for us. I can't wait to hand over to both of them, but before that, I would like to read out a brief introduction to our speakers. Professor Calkins is a clinical professor of marketing at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. He helps people and organizations build strong brands as an author, speaker, and consultant. Tim works with major corporations around the world. Banks include Eli Lilly, Medtronic, AB InBev, and AbbVie. He's managing director of Class 5 Consulting, a marketing strategy firm. Coming to Gordon Ho, he's a former chief marketing officer and head of sales at Princess Cruises. He's currently principal at the Expertainment Group, a marketing and experience consultancy. Earlier this year, he and his team navigated the COVID-19 outbreaks aboard the Diamond Princess and Grand Princess cruise ships off the coasts of Japan and the US, respectively. Gordon previously co-founded My Movie Deals Inc. and was EVP of Worldwide Content, Marketing and Business Development at the Walt Disney Company. To start off, Gordon Ho will walk us through these events, and he will discuss best practices for nimble and effective crisis management in today's 24/7 environment. But before that, I would like to hand it over to Professor Calkins to set the stage, and I welcome everyone once again, Professor Calkins.
All right, Satish. Well, thank you so much. It is, well, I'm thrilled to be here and thrilled to be part of this because if you think about an interesting topic in the world, I can't think of anything that right now for marketers is more interesting than the whole story of Princess and how the company navigated through all of that. You know, in terms of brands, I think it is a really tough time. So at Kellogg, we teach a lot about how do we build great brands. And when you think about building great brands, you know, it's all about things like customer delight and consistency in delivery and exceeding expectations and creating a loyal core of followers. This is what we talk about because this is what builds great brands. And the thing that's so interesting though right now is that for so many brands, doing all that is almost impossible. I mean, how do you do that in a world where we're struggling with COVID, with disruption? Even at Kellogg, and you look at Northwestern, you know, well, what do you do? The whole football season is now gone. And now what do you do with that? And the challenge becomes for marketers is how do you do great marketing and how do you build good brands in a world where everything's going crazy? And I think the experience at Princess is fascinating. So I'm really excited to have a chance to talk with Gordon today and to learn more about that experience and what was behind it and what we can learn from it. Now, let me tell you what we're going to do today, how all this will unfold. So we're going to start off and we're going to spend the first bit, probably 15, 20 minutes, maybe 25. And Gordon's going to take us through the sort of the story and what happened and what they did. And if you're familiar with the whole story, this will be a good reminder. But I think it's really interesting to look at all the different parts of it. Then we'll spend 20 or 25 minutes, and I've got some questions for Gordon to sort of get our discussion going, to follow up on all of that. We'll talk about that. And then we're going to spend 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and sort of open up the floor for questions and get your questions, get your comments for Gordon, and talk about this. I think we all have a lot to learn from what's happening in the world and what they went through and what other brands are struggling with. Couple logistics as we go through it. Number one, we are recording this. So if you want to go back and watch it again and again and again, you can do that. And I'm sure it is one of those things that you want to do. I know. Number two, if you do have questions, best way to do that is go ahead and post them in the chat. And Satish is going to keep track of those. And you can go ahead and chat and comment and participate on there. And that's fine as well. And it's a great place to post your questions. When we get to that point, and do jump in with questions when we get there. Also, in terms of logistics, good to keep just yourself muted unless you're speaking and asking a question. Of course, then you unmute yourself, but otherwise good to keep yourself muted. Try to keep the dog quiet if we can. On that front, also, as we did say, though, if you do want to turn your video on, it's great to see everybody, and we all have more fun if we can see you. And so if you are comfortable doing that, just turn that on. It makes it more fun for all of us. So I think that's it. Anything in terms of logistics I'm missing here? Hey, Bridget, anything we're missing in terms of logistics on this thing?
I think that's great. If anybody wants to use speaker view, if you want to just focus on the presenter, that's a great tip too. And you can keep looking at all the individual faces if you like that. But.
All right, perfect. All right, well, very good. Without further ado then, I think we've got everything covered off. Let's turn over to Gordon then, and let's get sort of the background here of what happened anyway, and what was it like being CMO through that sort of experience? And I don't know, going over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Tim. Hey, before we go, there's something you said, Tim, about crisis. You talked about the Big Ten football season, Pac-12 being done with. I heard it was just postponed. So please, we're still hoping that it comes back in early next year. We'll see. But I think you made the statement.
Yeah, we are all hoping. We're all hoping. But I'm not. What's unclear to me is how they're going to play football in like February. I mean, that's going to be really chilly here in Chicago. But you know, maybe we'll see. Hopefully we'll get some football in before the academic year is done.
Okay. So, on to, obviously there's so many things that have been impacted. I do hope we're going to go through some slides. I hope there's some good takeaways for everybody on this call. I do want to shout out that what I'm trying to represent is a story that was a culmination of so many people across the Princess Cruises organization. So by no means can I take even a fraction of the credit. I am just happy to be the ambassador here of all the stories and all the great work that people did. Number two, I do know there's some of my cruise colleagues on the phone here, so thank you. Please feel free to add any color in the commentary chat or questions, because you have a perspective that maybe I didn't represent or might be helpful for the audience, especially for the takeaways, okay? So a little bit of tech check. Am I coming through okay, Bridget and Tim? All right. I'm going to now share the screen, spend another about 15, 20 minutes kind of setting up the situation. So for those of you who are, as Tim said, are aware of it, it's a nice refresher. And those of you who don't know, it provides some context of what we went through. Okay, so bear with me. Bridget, give me a thumbs up. How does it look? Is it there? All right, Tim. Okay,
looks
great.
Good. Gordon, perfect.
All right, guys. So as Tim and Satish said, I was most recently the CMO, head of sales at Princess Cruises, now the principal at Expertainment. And I wanted to take the time to talk about some of our our COVID learnings, and really the crisis takeaways that I hope are applicable and maybe helpful for all of you who are tuning in here. So first, to set the context, I think many of you are aware this was about towards the beginning, in terms of a lot of us who are tuning in from the US. I think at this point in time, this crisis, this unfolding pandemic was taking place largely in China and Asia. So I think having this event unfold on Diamond Princess was really the first time that we saw globally, certainly in the US, how it impacted a lot of people. So in terms of Princess, just as a reminder, this took place on Diamond Princess cruise ship, which left Japan for a cruise in Asia. And on January 25th, one of our guests disembarked in Hong Kong. We didn't know at the time, and we were told results. We learned that on February 1st, this guest tested positive for COVID. And that's when the process was in place to say, okay, let's quickly get back to Japan and let's work with the Japanese Ministry of Health to test people to see if we had any other positive cases beyond the gentleman who left the ship on January 25th. And unfortunately, that's when we learned that there were 10 people that were tested positive. And that really began, I think, the crisis which unfolded and a lot of what I'm going to share with you today. Let's see. So this quickly became the situation aboard Diamond Princess. You had Japanese health officials coming on board. You also had media, you can see in the lower right, that planted themselves to try to cover the news and the different events that were unfolding. And in terms of just how, from a Princess perspective, in terms of preparation, Princess, like all the other brands of the Carnival Corporation, we have emergency response centers. We do drills, both on the ship and on shore. Of course, this was a drill that I don't think anyone could have practiced, this global pandemic, which is COVID-19, but nonetheless, we do practice for many drills, and we did stand up our emergency response centers. And what we had is teams on board the ship, teams at Princess headquarters in California. We also quickly sent a team over to Japan to work with our local teams in Tokyo. And we had functional teams, the executive team, people within medical, fleet, and so forth. I'm going to cover a lot, focus on the communications, marketing, and content teams. One takeaway that I'll leave for you starting off, I'm going to try to use this light bulb as a key learning takeaway that might be helpful for you, is the importance of the ability to do collaborative editing and approvals. So in the midst of a crisis, as you are communicating and creating content, you need to find a way to have, okay, all the stakeholders who are involved to be able to collaborate and approve content. And so in this case, we use OneDrive. You can use Google Doc, but kudos to our head of communications, Brian O'Connor, who said, hey, let's make sure we're all using this tool. So whatever tool you use, make sure from all the way to top management to all the people that are working on this, that you are all using the same platform to allow for collaborative editing and approval. That was a lifesaver. The other thing we try to do in the area of communication is to reduce communication friction. What I mean by that is that no matter what you do, people say, well, I didn't see that. I didn't hear about that. So we tried to make sure that everybody heard things because we used multiple points of contact, whether it was announcements by Captain Arma on the upper left, things in the cabin, such as what we used in the cabin television or cabin phones, social media, of course, our website and email, and of course, cabin flyers. And thankfully, a lot of this was enabled because we had turned on ultra high-speed internet, which we call MedallionNet, literally the voyage before. So that was really important to allow two-way communication between us and the guests with loved ones and so forth, and us with the crew, of course. As you're making all this content across all of these different mediums, another takeaway is identifying quickly where are the resources. Most of you have resources in your organizations to make content, but to create the amount of content you need in a crisis, it goes fivefold, tenfold. And so finding writers, video producers, web content, making sure people are there 24/7 across social media. We needed care team volunteers, which I'll talk more about. And importantly, international. This was a global event. Princess has global offices, and so we had to make sure we stood up local teams for helping in translation, local content creation, monitoring social media. So really, again, one takeaway is be prepared to say, who are the people that can help us create this content? Another takeaway that I think is important is figuring out what your central source of truth is or information. And the left side, that's really our website. I would call it this is our notices and advisory section, where we would literally list out daily updates for people. And it became really, I would say, one of our primary central sources of information. So on the right, you can see this is a social media post, but we refer to our notices and advisories page. And this was to, this helps make sure that we have a consistency of information, that we don't have quote unquote content divergence, if you will, because I think you want to make sure you can keep the versioning consistent. And that's always, of course, an issue as well. Hold on. Another thing that was critical for us to help, because of all the content that was being made, all of different statements that were being made, is to make sure that we have an established priority for all. And this one was pretty clear. I'll read it. The safety, security, and well-being of our guests and crew is our absolute priority. So for those of you who are going through a particular crisis, I think it's I think it's evident that you should make sure it's all clear. What is the goals? What is the priorities that everyone's following? Because you have people around the world working on this, and clearly they have to be focused on what is your goal. And of course, in this particular case, I want to call it the point below. This was all done in collaboration with the Japanese Ministry of Health. They had oversight and jurisdiction of the ship. And so everything we did was under the jurisdiction of the Japanese Ministry of Health. They were the ones that made the call. And for example, the idea that the best way to keep everyone safe is to do a quarantine, that was the Japanese Ministry of Health. And of course, we collaborated and worked very hard with them on enforcing that and doing everything we could to ensure the welfare of the guests. And in terms of health, here's just some examples of how we're supporting excuse me. Oh, hold on, guys. All right. Here's an example. Here's just some visuals of how we work together with the health officials. Both, of course, the testing of officials. In the middle, you have us delivering, whether it's food or supplies to guests. And on the right, you see Captain Arma in the bridge. And then I want to give full credit to Captain Arma, the leadership team, and everything that they did. Number one, he referred to his team as gladiators. That you guys are gladiators. You're being very brave. Thank you for this. And the other thing he did is he told everybody, the guests and the crew, you know, he used this phrase, "A diamond is a chunk of coal that did well under pressure." Of course, we're on board Diamond Princess, and I think everybody was going through a lot of pressure, and I think he recognized it, but he also said, look, we're going to get through this together. So he was really good at communicating and articulating and getting people to stay calm and really motivated to work hard and work together. Here's just some examples of, you know, taking care of guests, sending them thermometers or masks. We actually got everybody iPhones, the Japanese Ministry of Health. We made sure they got that for communication. And lower right, that's the fresh air break. Every day we made sure guests could get an hour of fresh air socially distanced. With all of the content, all of the information that needed to be disseminated, one of the things that we did in addition to sending out statements and releases and announcements is to the extent that we could, we tried to create as much video content. We really felt that this helped people better, it helped us better connect with the constituents, but it also it got across how much we really did care, and we did, and it was important to have, whether it was our executives like President Jan Schwartz, our chief medical officer, our head of experiences, to let them know, here's what's going on, here is what we are doing. And I think putting a face to it, I think let them know that there are real people that are working behind the scenes and in the scenes to do everything we can to ensure the health and well-being of everybody. And it also went on to other folks. Our head of operations talked about how we set up care teams. So on the ship, for people who needed consultation, both medical consultation or even like psychiatric or mental consultations, we made that available. And for family and friends, we also had access to experts for them to talk to as well. On the lower right, this is our head of HR for the fleet. We did video talking about, here's what we're doing to take care of the crew, because a lot of people are asking, well, how's the crew doing? And you can see on the social media posts the reaction to these videos. So I think people really wanted to know, and they were happy to hear about the things that were being done. The other thing we did on social is we shared positive news and staff updates. I mentioned to you, people want to know how the crew is doing, and it was important sometimes to have the crew themselves share. So we wanted to say, hey, you know, we know you're busy, but would you mind doing a little video about how you're doing? This is Natalie, the cruise director. So the entertainment team really did a great job of taking care of our guests, and it was nice for them to say, hey, we're hanging in there. And on the right, you should watch. I'll tell you about it. You can watch this video, but these are people dancing during their fresh air break. A little bit of levity that was shared by some of our guests, and we made sure to reshare that, repost it, because I think people knew that despite all that was happening, there were still these moments, uplifting moments that was taking place. I mentioned to you about some of the the stuff we did to ensure the well-being because of dealing with boredom and other things. So we had extended content on television, movies, and TV shows, board games, daily Sudoku, magazines, newspapers, fitness content. We even had a magician on board who agreed to do, live magic, and we would record it for people in the rooms. Food, of course, was an important part of the day for the guests because it was one of the times that they would get some interaction and get the food. And you can see here, a lot of work was being done to make sure that dietary needs were met. We tried to do some surprise and delight moments, whether it's a nice bottle of wine or some chocolate for Valentine's Day. Some of the passengers actually became food reviewers. This is Matthew Smith. Matthew Smith started with 13 followers on Twitter. By the end of the ship, he had 14,000 followers by the end of the cruise. So he became a very colorful critic of the food. More often than not, he really raved about the food. He actually made a comment, "You're gonna have to drag me off this quarantine. I enjoy the food so much." But it was a great place to monitor how things are going and to give feedback, whether it's the culinary team, that it was appreciated. Here's another couple that posted this couple, Ryan and Rachel Torres. They did an Ask Me Anything Reddit. Tyler and Rachel Torres, I'm sorry. And what Tyler did is he created a Reddit and he started to answer hundreds and thousands of questions that people were sending him real time. And then he would post literally every few minutes, "Here's what's going on. We just got lunch. We just got dinner. Here's what's going on outside the ship." So it also became a valuable source of information for us and for me personally to hear from a guest perspective. The other thing that I want to let you know is that the guests actually set up their own private Facebook groups and other private groups. I didn't think it was appropriate for me or others to join it because it was meant for the passengers themselves. But through people like the Torreses, when I reached out to them and said, "Hey, would you mind giving me feedback? If there's something that you think we should be aware of, please let us know." And they were more than happy to share with me and others, "Hey, here's something you should be aware of." In fact, Tyler and Rachel got so many followers on the Reddit that people were saying, "What can I do to help?" And I think he had almost 50 to 80 care packages delivered to passengers because there's all these people who wanted to help. And so it's amazing of the goodwill from not just the crew, which did a phenomenal job, but even some of our fellow passengers and guests. And you can see the further appreciation of the crew. These are some of the messages that were put on the cabin doors for the crew to let them know, "Hey, we know you're doing amazing things to keep us safe and to feed us. Thank you, thank you, thank you." And I think this really went a long way. And we felt, you know what, it's so important for other people to know because not everybody is delivering food. How do we let the rest of the crew know how much we appreciate all they're doing and everybody on board? And so we actually tried to create a social movement. And under a hashtag, Hang in There Diamond Princess, I'll give full credit to Jan Schwartz, our president. She actually said, we were trying to decide what was the right hashtag, and we found out that this was trending in Japanese in Japan, so we translated it and made it a global hashtag. And you have all these people around the globe that used it to express their support for the people on Diamond Princess. On the lower left, that's Gavin McLeod and Jill Whelan, better known as Captain Stubing and daughter Vicky Stubing from the Love Boat. So they sent a personal message to the people on Diamond Princess, and really well received. And you can just see here, this is Matthew again, the food reviewer, saw the video and said, "Hey, this is really cool. Thanks for the support." And you see another guest, Yardley W., who used the hashtag Hang in There Diamond Princess. So again, a lot of positive feedback from the outpouring of support that went to the ship. And so I think in some ways there's a lot of positivity of people working together, but the fact remained that I think what was tough for the crew and the passengers was that, every day there would be announcements of like, "Hey, these are the number of cases of COVID or coronavirus as it was referred to at the time." And that was tough for people to hear, right? Because, there's a growing number of people that were testing positive. And so one of the things that happened that many of you were aware of is that there was a decision made, some discussions made within the State Department at the US, CDC, and HHS that, hey, we think it's best if we evacuate our Americans on board, crew and guests, have them fly home, And so this presented an interesting challenge for us because suddenly now we had cohorts of guests and crew who were going to be flown to US, and later very quickly Canada, UK, Australia, other countries followed. But we also had people that were on the ship who chose not to go for whatever reason, or the crew, a lot of the crew had to stay, of course, to just manage the ship. So very quickly, we had to get additional resources to set up regional care teams to support our guests who are flying to, say, the US and other countries. And here's an example. This is a photo of just some of these care teams that were stood up to help support the guests. In this particular case, these are images in the US and Canada, these care teams that were both on site at the bases, as well as both at the home office. Some of the things that the care teams did, for example, were we actually created these personalized cards of our logo and a heart, and we actually had thousands of personal written notes that were sent to the guests. And these notes were sent in these care packages. And I wanted to thank all the care team for the wonderful work that they did. Really, really amazing stuff. Everybody really, really stepped it up here and really made such a difference. And of course, not only did we get them care and we worked with the military, but we also worked to get them home. I'll pause here and say that in addition to getting guests home and helping make sure they got home, during the quarantines that took place across the several weeks of this, as you may know, there were issues that took place. There was a run on toilet paper across the country. There was a number of things. So we also worked with them on supply chain. We helped secure toilet paper, blankets, phones. So we really worked closely with HHS CDC to help support the needs of the people on the bases, our guests and others too. So it was really a great teamwork environment. But back here, you can see these moments of people being released from the quarantine. This was before social distancing because it really hadn't come to this country. And you can see people literally came out in tears because they had been in quarantine for about 28 days. And they were so delighted to be on their way home. And while that was taking place, actually a little bit before then, some of the guests were able to depart Diamond Princess. So these are the Japanese guests that were going home in particular. And Jan Schwartz went over to Japan to personally greet them and express her support. And I think that made a big difference as well, greeting the guests that were leaving the ship in Japan. And so ultimately, what did this all mean? And by no means was this the end of the crisis, but let's assume this is part one of the story that concluded, which is getting the guests home from military bases, from the ship in Japan. And I think ultimately when you said, so this was the important impact to our brand. Here's one example. This is a quote from Captain Steve Fermansky. He was one of the leaders of one of the bases over in Travis Air Force Base in Sacramento. And this is just literally what he said. I tell people that I'll be going on a Princess Cruise. I was so impressed with how you supported our operation and took care of the guests. Your service on the ship must be amazing. So really we gained a lot of advocates across people there. And ultimately, I'll conclude with this, and then we can open it up, Professor. You can see this quote on social media. You know, we always thought Princess was top notch. They have proven it during this crisis. We won't cruise with any other line. And you can see here one of our ships doing the lights. We will be back. So wherever they can, everybody try to chip in, have moments of support, positivity, and so forth. So that kind of concludes the upfront section, a little bit of the crisis, a little bit of some of the messages that we did. I hope that was helpful, and happy to talk, Tim and Professor Calkins, that is, and let me stop the share.
All right. What an incredible story, Gordon, to go through sort of all of that. So I have a question for you. So certainly like the coordination must have been so important. Can you talk about that? Was there like sort of a crisis team set up ahead of time that came together, or did you have to say, wait?
No. I mean, I think like we have the emergency response centers. We've done drills, et cetera. So there are people who are assigned in roles to these emergencies. The emergencies we practice for, though, we didn't practice for this. I don't think anybody could have practiced for COVID-19, but we did practice emergencies. So I think very quickly we stood it up, and it's helpful because the systems that we have set up allow for us to share information. I think what we had to do is, given the enormity of the situation, we had to stood up additional teams, because this, you know, most crises will take place maybe over a day or two or three. This kept going. And I think we had to make sure we had enough support 24/7. So we had to make sure we had people for different time zones to support different areas, to make sure we identified resources globally because of the local needs. For example, also social media monitoring. Social media was being posted in every country. So we wanted to identify who are the resources monitoring that, how do we respond to that, et cetera. So I would say we had a good base, Professor, but then we built additional pillars to support this unique crisis.
Right. And what was the link between the captain? Because I think on the captain, sort of the key person on the ship, versus the team, like the crisis team at headquarters. Like how did that work?
So I would say that very quickly, I mentioned we sent a team to Japan, right? And so we had people who are very familiar with the fleet who did a lot of the primary communication with the captain. The other thing, so what we did is, how do we support the captain? So what does the captain need? Captain needs, okay, I want to do regular announcements to the guests and the crew. So we would figure out resources both in headquarters in California and within Japan, depending on the time zone. Let's write the basis of the announcement for the captain, right? So then they could then take it and then of course translate it. So that was a regular workflow for the captain. The other thing that we tried to do is for example, facilitating the seamless flow of communication. So remember, the Japanese Ministry of Health were doing the testing. So if they tested and found that, hey, we have 20 additional people positive, we thought it was important to make sure that the captain let the passengers know first before it went public, say on NHK. And so that was something that it wasn't the case initially, because sometimes, unfortunately, the passengers would find out through public news versus the captain's announcement. So we've quickly got that with our partnership with the Japanese Ministry of Health and their communications team. So really it was about how do we coordinate sources of information, making sure it goes through the appropriate channels and make sure it's done in the right timing.
Yeah. And did you have one person in the company who sort of saw all the communication before it went out? Or how did that work? Because I could see
this goes back to what I said about, in terms of us making sure that everybody was using the central tool, right? And what we made sure is, because anything that went out from a press release in particular, our president took a look at it. We made sure that all of that stuff, because that piece of content was then used subsequently around the world. And so the key is, hey, we actually set up times, Tim, to say, hey, we're going to have this cadence of content that is sent out. And so we're going to make sure that everybody's available for this half-hour window to review it under a shared doc, and let's make sure we all did it. Now, of course, there are things that popped up outside of those windows, right? And that, of course, you work together and say, hey, this is hot. We have to address this particular thing that just came up. So if the Japanese Ministry of Health would have a statement to say, hey, we have 20 more positives, then we would make sure to say, hey, we have to take that content, package it, make sure it gets through the appropriate channels. Otherwise, we try to make sure there's a regular cadence of content and make sure that the right people were available for approvals, and that went all the way up to the top.
Got it. And how about social? So you talked about monitoring on social.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about, how do you respond on social? For example, so you see something on Twitter, and somebody posts something on Twitter, and maybe it's incorrect, or maybe it's very negative, or whatever.
Well,
do you respond to that?
I would say it's a good question. I'm sorry. There's a couple layers to that, Professor. One is, we had a lot of people trying to monitor Twitter and social media, especially even some of the passengers. Like, so if a passenger did a post that says, hey, I could really use some more coffee. And, you would hope that they would, call the front desk, whatever, but sometimes they would do social media. And so that was one of our priorities, is to make sure, hey, let's make sure we take care of the needs of the people on the ship. And so social media was a valuable feedback mechanism. Like I also meant with Tyler and Rachel Torres, they also, by monitoring the private Facebook groups, they could let us know, hey, there's some stuff that you need to do. So that's part one. And so, yes, we responded directly and took action to any of those social media posts. Then there's some bystanders who write commentary like says, oh, I can't believe they did this. I can't believe they did that. Quite frankly, we didn't respond to all of those things, right? Because everybody had a point of view. Everybody is trying to judge one action versus the other action versus the other action. And I mean, just if you look at it, Professor Tim, just even think of today, right? Northwestern, you said, is going to try to open. I'm sure there's just as many people says, are you really going to try to open or not? So back then, I think for us to try to explain every decision that had been made, for example, by the Japanese Ministry of Health, that wasn't our place. But what we would say is, hey, this was done in cooperation with the decision by the Japanese Ministry of Health. So we would try to make sure people understood how things were decided, because ultimately everyone is trying to do the right thing based on the information that was available at the time.
And I would bet the tonality of these things and sort of the cultural sensitivity has to be really intense, because you want to be very supportive of all the government affairs all around, and you want to be as cooperative but so getting the right words has to be so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, Carolyn just commented here. She's one of the members who was part of the team who was on the crew, and she sent a chat, I just think, and she mentioned that a lot of the social media content that we created was also sent to the onboard team to respond to and react. So like I mentioned to you earlier, the importance of social media and the reaction. So much of what we monitor 24/7 was able to be actioned by the team on board, and vice versa. So it was, in today's age, the importance of listening to the guest across all the channels is critical. But back to you, Tim, in terms of, you were talking about the sentiment of the language. I just want to make sure I'm clear.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, getting the tonality right, especially with government and health officials.
Yeah,
that's one of the things that's tricky.
Yeah, I think there's no question. I think that the Japanese government is an important, partner of ours, both in cruising in Japan, and of course they were the ones that were in charge here. And I don't envy the decisions they had to make. I think importantly, we were part of the discussion. They included us, WHO, CDC, et cetera. And, I think what we could do, our best thing is, how do we help enable the things that wanted to get done? So if they said, hey, we need to, obviously we want to keep them here, we think it's safer because we don't think we can take them and evacuate them into hospitals in Japan. So obviously they needed us to partner with them to execute the quarantine, to execute providing food and supplies. And I think so many people took on different jobs, the entertainment team, various members of the staff. I mean, they really rose to the challenge, and really under the leadership of Captain Arma.
Right. And what do you say, one of the hard things these days is there's so much we don't know. The uncertainty is so big, but at that point, there was so much we didn't know, and everything was changing so fast every day. How do we proceed? How did that affect, what do you say to people?
Yeah.
If you think about, you want to manage expectations, but how do you do that when you don't even know what's going to happen next?
Well, that's a great question. So let me give you an example early on, right? So what do you think? There's different stakeholders wanting different information, but if you're on board the ship, clearly when the captain announces different things going on, but the news, of course, would be, are there new passengers that have been tested positive? And part of it is like, okay, what does it mean? So let's say you have, 10 people test positive or 20. And this is where working with the Japanese Ministry of Health, CDC, WHO, our chief medical officer, initially it was you have to explain to them, this is the facts, right? This index patient who got off in Hong Kong was on the cruise for 5 days, right? He was on from the 20th through the 25th. And during that time, he socialized with people, et cetera. And so I don't think we realized anybody knew how contagious it was, right? We just weren't aware. And so when we started to report positive cases, when you look at the curve, right, the epidemiology curve, it's very much explained by, hey, this index patient maybe spread it to a few people and it may have spread, et cetera. So I think the debate is, how much do you explain that, hey, this is normal as a result of the curve? Clearly, we're all alarmed when there's positive cases. You would like to say, hey, 10 cases and no more, but obviously there was many more that came afterwards. So I think, Tim, it was like when we got facts or strong points of view that we could issue from the WHO or CDC or the Japanese Ministry of Health, we tried to share it, to explain this is what's going on in the ship. But again, even today, we're still debating the spread of the disease, right? Even today.
Well, there's so much we don't know.
Right. And so that's why I think we did the best we could based on who would go on record, who would say this, but we did the best we could.
Right. And it's interesting, I think probably being open with people is so important, because then at least you communicate here's what we know. There's a lot we don't know. Here's what we think is the case. But, you know, it's so hard, you know, especially on a cruise, because I've been in a typical cruise. Everything is pretty well contained and controlled.
Yeah.
You know where it's going to go, what time things are open. You know, the Lido deck's going to be open at 4, and the art auction's at 2. And, you know, I love cruises, by the way. So but now all of a sudden everything's up in the air for the guests, and managing their expectations has to be totally different in that kind of a setting.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's why there was some sense of regular cadence, right? The meals, right? Because obviously delivering room service to everybody is not necessarily in the plan, right? When you're on a cruise, you don't plan on giving room service to everybody, right? That's not the case. So I think that was a big stand up. So over time, I think there was a cadence of a meal. So that became part of their normalcy. The fact that there was content available for them to do, a regular newspaper, the daily Sudoku puzzle, the regular captain's announcement. People established their own cadence because they had internet and phone service to call their loved one maybe at a particular time. So I think a lot of people did establish some amount of regularity on the ship, to the extent that you could say it's normal. I mean, the new normal is what you hear. I think a lot of guests managed to do it. Matthew Smith, his cadence was he would write a review after the food. That was his cadence. And people would tune in to see, what did Matthew write today? Other people would tune into the private Facebook group in a given time and try to share. So I think everybody dealt with the crisis in their way, but I think there were certain elements of cadence that helped create some normalcy and cadence within the ship.
And what kind of feedback have you gotten from the passengers who went through the whole experience? You know, at the end of the, you know,
yeah,
wild experiences, right? But what kind of feedback have you gotten?
Yeah, I think that I was able to talk to many guests at the bases, and overwhelmingly it was positive. They said, you know what, you stood with us all the way through and through, right? So they really appreciated the transparency. I think you said that, Tim. So the content that was shared, the videos from Jan or Dr. Grant or others, and they said, we felt like you were doing your best to keep us informed. We really appreciate the captain and the crew being so open and helpful. And ultimately, you know, seeing them all the way through to make sure they got home. Because, you know, we could have, I don't want to say we would have, but, you know, we could have said they're off the ship. They're no longer our guests, right? When you leave a plane, United doesn't care what you do when you leave the plane. Well, maybe they do. I shouldn't, if anyone's there from United, I take it all back. I don't know. But it's like, I think that when people typically leave our ship, the cruise is over, they're going home. But in this case, this unique circumstances, we wanted to stay connected to them. And I think they really appreciated that we were there greeting them when they got off the bases. I mean, we were there to make sure they got home. And that made a big difference. So their feedback in general has been nothing but positive. And when people have done interviews, because I don't know if you know this, Tim, that so many people were asked to do interviews from the ship, right? CNN.
Like every news organization wanted to do an interview with a passenger. Absolutely.
Yeah. And they would reach out. They would see someone tweet and they say, hey, please DM me because we'd like to interview you on CNN or MSNBC or whatever it may be. And so when they asked the question, would you go on a cruise again? Almost every one of them said, I would go back and I'm planning to go back, right? And I think that's a testament to how they were being treated.
What'd you do? There must have been some people who were grumpy. I mean, there's always some people who are grumpy in the world. What'd you do if there was like a really grumpy passenger? How did you handle them? Or they were not necessarily grumpy as in a bad person, but they were totally scared, unsatisfied, disrupted.
Yeah, I think.
How do you handle those people who aren't having a great experience?
Well, I think that's what the crew did so well. Right? Like if we found out through a post or through the tourisms or something, hey, these people need a little bit extra support, they could use an out, you know, someone would call them maybe, or they would visit or whatever it would be. I think that's where it would be. Or someone would say, hey, I could use some extra coffee. Whatever the need would be, I think that's what the crew did so well, was to say, hey, you know, starting from, hey, let's say someone, heaven forbid, had a fever, right? Everyone had a thermometer. If they had a fever, right, they called in, we got on that right away. So there's different elements of support that they needed, Professor Tim, but I think we did our best to address everything, and where we could exceed expectations. I think someone made a comment that, boy, I could use some whiskey. We got them a bottle. Jan made sure they got a bottle of whiskey, and they did, I think, a virtual toast together. So we tried to do certain moments of that as well, above and beyond. and it's the right thing to do.
So as you look now at what brands are dealing with, and the interesting thing is, so you had like this really intense at the forefront of it, right? Now the pandemic is continuing. It's causing more disruption to lots of businesses.
Yeah.
What do you learn from that intense sort of experience you had that for brands that are navigating it now? Well, like Northwestern dealing with the whole football and all the disruption we're going through. What do you take away from that you'd sort of learnings?
Right. Well, I think that immediately following this crisis, a lot of work we've been doing is obviously on health protocols. So I think everybody has to, depending on how they've been impacted, if you're in hospitality or sports, you certainly have to find a way to make everyone feel safe, right? And I think that's a critical thing. How do you have to adapt the experience or adjust the experience in light of this new normal? I mean, the fact is, think about how we've all adjusted at home. And I think the bar has been risen. If you're going to leave your home and do something else, you have to feel safe, because otherwise you can just stay at home. A lot of people have become chefs. They've become decent cooks. I don't know, good cooks. They've learned to become mixologists at home. I mean, there's a lot of people who've adapted. Video producers, content. It's amazing what people have learned and adapted to. People all know how to use Zoom. Now there's clearly the executives all know how to use Zoom. So the idea of flying for a business meeting, that's a higher bar.
Yeah.
And so I think all of us who are selling products or whatever it may be have to say, okay, in this new environment, what are we doing to raise the bar on the experience so that people say, you know what, I am going to do this, because there is a little heightened maybe risk or trepidation for some people. So in terms of cruising, we're going to have to make sure when we resume that people feel safe and that we go above and beyond to make sure that. That could be the same for a ball game, a stadium, a movie theater, all of those things people are going to have to do. I mean, that's one. So number one, change the experience. And I think the second thing is just really empathy. I think, Tim, the one thing I will say is a takeaway for everybody is really, really showing a degree of empathy, knowing that there's people who are scared, nervous, who just don't know. And I think that's an underlying trait that I think we followed as a guiding light, our crew, our employees. And I would say for everyone, show some empathy here in these times. And I think that'll go a long way.
Absolutely. What is your outlook for sort of when cruising will get going again? Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of how long it's going to take?
Yeah. Well, I think there's two things. One is our guests going to go back to cruising. And as you may know, just like you said, Professor Tim, that you like cruising, the net promoter score of cruising is off the charts. People love cruising. And so the number of people who are saying, I can't wait to get back is enormous. If you saw, I think a number of cruise lines report that 2021 has extremely high bookings. And so I think then it's a matter of timing, right? Because the loyalty of people who love cruising is so high. And in terms of when it is, that for me to hazard a guess would be premature. I think there's a number of things working with the CDC, et cetera, on how that unfolds. So I would hope sooner than later for the people who can't wait to get on. But for me to guess when, I'm not going to play that game.
People really do, but people really do love cruising. Like the people, like the real cruisers, they cruise a lot.
Oh yeah, and the research that's been done, Tim, is that for people who do cruising and do like land-based vacations, when you look at how they rate it, they always rate cruising higher than that. And I think I'll tell you what I think is the secret sauce beyond the efficiency of you only unpack once, you get to travel while you're sleeping. It's this idea that it's like summer camp for adults is how I describe it. You and me could be next to each other or whatever at a bar, and I could talk to you. So where are you from? And that's something that may not take place at a normal vacation. You may not, and you actually can meet new people, make friends. And as you know, the key to happiness is strong social connections. A lot of people develop lifelong connections through cruising, and that really doesn't happen in many other forms of vacations. And I think it's that camaraderie that really makes it sticky for people. One of the things.
I guess that's right. You're on the ship together, and you're there for a certain period of time, and you bump into each other on more than one occasion, and it's isn't that interesting?
Yeah,
but that'll be a challenge, because how do you social distance in that kind of a world?
Well, I think that's what I think this is where I think part of the challenge is going to be. If part of the benefit of cruising is the social camaraderie that comes about of it, what's the new version of socializing within social distancing? And I think that's what I mean by the new experience. Cruising is going to have to figure that out, because I do think that's an important part of the cruise experience.
Right. I mean, I think there's lots of organizations where we're going to have to figure out, how do we do that? Like, how do you promote social connections in a way, in a world where there's a virus floating around. And I think that's a real issue for that's an issue for cruises, but it's an issue in education, and it's an issue in, arts and entertainment, so many different things. How do we do that?
I mean, I think you're seeing, and for people who are living in the cities where they're setting up tables in the streets. My son tells me that outside his apartment, they've set up tables in the streets. They block out the streets at night, and they're using it for open dining, and outside my home. So I think a lot of the restaurants are reinventing themselves, saying, "Hey, we're going to set up dining outside," because I think they've shown that that's pretty safe to be outside, the dilution effect. And so I think people have to rethink that, right? We talked about, right? You have Live Nation doing drive-in concerts. So I think different things are being done by different companies. And I think this is where the spirit of innovation really comes through. And I think you see a lot of that happening.
It is different. I know my classes are certainly going to be different this fall. I'm going to be in a huge room, and everybody's going to be sort of scattered around. There's like somebody back there and somebody over there and somebody over there. And that's how we're going to do it. And we'll see how that works out. But then the question is, how do you connect everybody in a way?
Right.
We'll have to figure that. I know we got a bunch of questions in the chat, so we should go ahead and just open it up and get some other questions from folks, because there's a lot to sort of talk about here. Hey, Satish, have you been keeping an eye on questions? Do you want to guide us through some of those?
Absolutely. We have few. I actually see Carolyn Spencer Brown with a video. We can take up her question. She asked a very important, very relevant question.
Oh, go for it. Hey, Carolyn, over to you.
Carolyn, you want to unmute and talk to the audience?
Unmute. So
there you are.
This is something I'm really quite passionate about and really quite disappointed in. And this is one of the big challenges in handling of this, is dealing with a media model that's fueled by traffic and perhaps less than cruise knowledgeable press. We're talking about a mainstream media outlet. There was a definite bias against cruise in coverage, even from well-regarded outlets. And I'll point out my biggest disappointment was the New York Times. And my question is, in this era, for you, Gordon, in this era of press coverage in which gotcha and click-based revenue is more important than getting it right, fair, and balanced, how does a brand battle this in the midst of crisis?
Oh, that's such a question,
Carolyn, great question. Gordon. Carolyn, before you go off, why don't you tell everybody who you are? Carolyn is one of the most esteemed people in the cruise industry, but you want to share just who, so people don't know who you are?
Yeah, I'm a cruise journalist. I started at the Washington Post. I was editor-in-chief of Cruise Critic, which is a consumer combination of editorial content and bulletin boards, largest in the world. It's owned by TripAdvisor. And I've worked with Gordon for years on various projects, both as part of my editor-in-chief responsibility, as part of my content strategist capability, and now as part of a consulting operation for cruise-related content direction. So I feel like what happened with Diamond Princess is abhorrent. And I am a journalist, and so how the business model, and I still feel that way today. You still see with Hurtigruten, when Hurtigruten this weekend or last weekend came out and said, we have an outbreak, and by the way, we didn't follow procedure, which was devastatingly irrational and horrible. We still had journalists jumping on that who know better because they get paid by clicks. So the business model of media has really changed to support this hysterical coverage. And I found it very disappointing.
So Carolyn, this is it's a really interesting question. I think it's a real challenge for brands today, because it doesn't matter really what industry you're in. There's always there are these groups that are very quick to attack. Like I teach biomedical marketing. And if you work in pharmaceuticals, there are all these groups that are just ready. Anything you say, they're ready to attack and say you're evil and terrible. And so what do you do with that, Gordon, as you work through this? How did you think about it?
It's tough because, I noticed that Carolyn's right. And there's actually journalists who said in private, you'll never hear it from me, but we try to do a form of clickbait, right? And that's how and you understand monetization, right? You're generally going to get more money from something sensationalistic than not. So I think there's twofold. One is, I don't think you can win. If we start to go after New York Times and blah, 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 I don't think we can win. I think it's better off to have your advocates, right? Be it, say, Carolyn Spencer Brown or passengers who say, that's not how it works. So I think in today's age, all of us need to make sure we have a cohort of advocates, of people who we say, please, it's up to you, but we, speak on our behalf, and they do, right? Just like I showed you some of the social posts from people who expressed their gratitude of what we were doing to the crew or what we were doing in terms of the welfare of the guests. So I think that's one thing. It's always better for a third party to address some of those quote unquote, maybe what Carolyn says, unfair commentary and news things. And then every once in a while, you may say, you know what, we're going to be proactive and we're going to talk to a reputable magazine or newspaper. But boy, it's scary because they may say, we're going to treat you fairly, but ultimately they want a story that's going to get read by millions of people. Yeah. So that's, I don't have a perfect answer.
Hey, Gordon, let me just push it. So the reason you don't respond, so let's say there's a news organization, they say something negative about your brand. The reason you don't directly respond is, why is that? Because you're never gonna win them over. And it's almost like beginning a discussion. It's like, how do you respond to a troll? Like somebody says something bad about you. Do you get into that discussion? Well, you're saying don't even start the discussion.
Oh, I think, well, there's two things. I have to be clear. If more often than not in the New York Times or whatever, they will reach out to us and say, hey, do you have these facts? Do you have comment, whatever? And they would say, hey, we're going to go to press in 8 hours or 6 hours. And we would respond. The communications team was on task 24/7 to provide facts, figures, points of view, etc. And I think that would soften maybe the angle of the story. Right? In many cases, I think the PR team actually changed the story that may have been negative to more neutral. Okay, so there were those cases that took place. So by no means do I say ignore, but more often than not, I think the reputable ones, including the New York Times that Carolyn was mentioning, did give generally a chance to comment. And so we would do our best to be factual, and that's what we would do.
And that's all you can do, and then let it work itself out and get your supporters to lobby for you. Interesting. All right, very good. Hey, Satish, what else do we have?
All right. Have a question from Chip, but there is another question by David Gutterman. I think we can combine these both. David's asking, what didn't work well? What decisions were made that you objected to? And that's directed towards Gordon. And Chip, do you want to add to your question that you asked, what would you do differently?
No, I mean, that basically captures it. Really detailed, though. Thank you for all this.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what? I think there was different perspectives, but nothing that I would say anyone disagreed vehemently about, because we all had this common theme of what can we do to ensure the welfare, the safety, and well-being of the guests. With that underlying cemented mantra, it was hard to do something off of that, right? No one said, hey, we're going to try to save money and not do something that would improve the health of the guests. That never happened, because I think people would have raised issues. Hey, that's not good, right? So that didn't happen because of the underlying principle of the health and well-being of our guests and a crew is a priority. In terms of what would we have done things differently? Boy, I don't know. I mean, I guess like if you were to go to the Japanese Ministry of Health and ask them now that, because they were in charge, would you have done things differently? We then would have implemented differently based on their guidance. I don't know if they would have done things differently. And if you read the reports they just issued, they've said, look at, they firmly believe the quarantine really did contain a lot of the spread of the virus. And so I didn't double check the facts, but assuming that's true, that was done by the Japanese health authorities, then everybody did what we could to contain it. So in that respect, that was accomplished, despite, unfortunately, the adverse impact to many, many guests, which was really too bad. If that's what that's recently just came out a few days ago or a week ago. So yeah. In that respect, all the efforts of doing a quarantine, if that was the case, which is what they're saying, then we did what we could, and it seemed to have worked.
Hey, Gordon, was that mantra, was that in place before this whole incident? Was that sort of a long-standing, or was that something that you sort of said, okay, as we go through this, here's what we're going to ground ourselves in?
No, I think there's no question. I mean, from our CEO, Arnold Donald, the health and safety first has always been the mantra, because If people don't feel safe, they're not going to be able to enjoy themselves on their vacation. So that's always an underlying mantra for us. And I think that really carried forward, of course, with this particular crisis, right? And there's also consequences, right? If something happens, heaven forbid, that people think, oh, your ship's not safe, I don't trust it, then no amount of marketing or PR is going to fix it. So we have to make sure it's a safe, healthy environment.
Got it. Right. Interesting. All right. Terrific. Satish, what else we got?
There's industry-specific question coming from Joe Husman.
Hey, Joe, what's your question, Joe?
Let me unmute him.
Oh, hey there.
There you go, Joe. You're good.
Hi there. No, I was just curious. I remember reading a Vanity Fair article that was really lengthy, but I think there were two groups of customers they dealt with, and one was the longest customer group that was on board and the longest crew group that was on board. And how did you deal with those differently in terms of the people that got off the ship early versus people that stayed on for a longer period of time?
Yeah, I think, Joe, I hinted at that. You're right. There's different cohorts of guests, right?
How long,
They're
just to ground us, how long was the longest guest on board in the quarantine phase or in total? Was that like a long time?
I don't quote me on this. Like the quarantine officially ended on the 19th. There were guests who got off on the 19th, the 20th, maybe the 21st as well of February.
All right.
So, you know, they started their cruise on the 20th of January, right? And obviously they went to Hong Kong, Taiwan, and but
a 10-day cruise or something?
Excuse me?
Well,
Yeah, it was a 2-week cruise. 2-week cruise, 14 days, and then, you know, they returned back in Japan about a half day early, the evening of the 3rd, and then they were then quarantined after the positive test on the 4th. And so they were 14 days. So basically, again, guests were released starting on the 19th, 20th, 21st, I think were the days just to sequence it. So I think most of the guests were off by that time.
Yeah.
And then the crew, though, stayed longer. They were asked to do quarantine, but of course, some of the countries like India, et cetera, also got planes, got them debarked later on. And then the last person off the ship was Captain Arma. So very, you know, brave soul, and he really led by example.
And he was the last person off the ship.
Yep. He was the last person off the ship.
Impressive, isn't it? That's how it's supposed to be, right? Where the captain sort of takes ownership of the whole crew.
Exactly. There's a wonderful image. If you search Captain Arma, Diamond Princess, you'll see there's a photo of, you'll see him wearing a mask coming off the ship with his hand luggage. And in terms of just how you dealt with it, I think that's like you had different teams, right? So in terms of, we literally had, for the people that were flown into Australia, the Australia team stood up and they were helping manage the people in the Australian quarantine facility. Same with the UK, same with Hong Kong. I was focused on US, Canada with my teams, but I think what we tried to do is share global best practices. So when we said we're going to do care packages and we're going to write notes, we made sure that those templates were sent to everybody. So I think there was a lot of global content that was created and distributed, and we stood up local teams to take care of their passengers that were flown to their local quarantine centers, whether that's at a military base or some other facility. And then, of course, there are people who were disembarked from Diamond Princess who maybe tested positive. They were moved into Japanese hospitals or facilities. We had care teams that were with them whenever they got off. That could have been February 5th, 9th, 10th. So there was always people on standby making sure they were taken care of. And then, of course, there was the people who remained on the ship until their quarantine ended. And we made sure Jan, like I said, Jan was there to greet them when they left the ship, our president. So you had a number of teams working together to really support the different cohorts of guests, no matter where they were.
And where do the care teams come from? Like who you said they were?
They're essentially volunteers. They're princess. There are people, a lot of them had earlier signed up and they had been trained in terms of, I mentioned empathy. They learned how do you be empathetic? How do you listen? How do you help address people? But very quickly, we enlisted a lot more people because the number of care team members that we needed, you know, were more than just the initial amount that were trained. And so we enlisted quite a few people to join care teams around the world, going to military bases, right? Flying to Texas, flying to Sacramento, all these different areas. Atlanta, we had people for Grand Princess, a ship later, we had people across, I think, 5 to 6 different facilities that we supported both on site and remotely.
Incredible. And what happened with the crew? Like, was there a special effort from the captain? Because the crew, it's interesting. So for a brand, one of the things we know is that the service delivery is so dependent on the employees and the team. And if the team is feeling great, they can deliver great customer service. But if they're not, they're never going to deliver great customer service. So what happened with the crew to make sure the crew was feeling okay and that they were prepared to do what needed to be done with the passengers?
Yeah, I think that there's two. And oh, by the way, just to correct, Carolyn, who was on Diamond Princess, wanted to clarify the last guest got off the ship on looks like the 24th, and the last crew got off on March 1st. So I think the captain got off either on March 1st or March 2nd. So in terms of the crew, right, clearly they were courageous under extenuating circumstances. And I think a number of things were done, right? One is the captain who acknowledged their courage, right? Calling them gladiators, talking to them. Initially, they were separate. There were announcements for the crew only, and then they were part of this broader team. And I think that there were things done by Jan, by announcements by our head of HR for the crew, really letting them know we were aware of what they were doing, communicating with them, and letting them know that we were there to support them. So, I don't know if there's anything we could say, hey, we magically snapped the fingers and removed all of the risk of spread for everybody on the ship. Clearly, we couldn't do that. But I think it was just to acknowledge that, hey, we're going to try to keep you as safe as possible through the things that were provided. And yeah, I mean, I don't really have much more to say. Maybe, huh?
The decision to one set of announcements, it's funny, that's a little thing, but it strikes me that's probably really important because it changes the whole thing from being about crew and guests to be about saying we're all going through this together.
That's right.
Where did that come from? Like, was that?
I think, that's a good question. It maybe Carolyn, who's been on there, knows. I think it was the captain who said, you know what, we're all in this together. Everybody wants to know about whether it's the reported cases of positive cases, whether it's a crew positive case or a passenger or a guest positive case, it doesn't matter. It's a positive case. And I think any number of reasons behind it. And it's a good point. I know the captain started doing it. I can't remember when that decision was to go towards doing. I don't think all of them maybe were like that, but a good chunk of them became one announcement to everybody. That's and I think it's because timeliness, right? It's all relevant to everybody. Here's what's going on. Right. And
I think you really want it to be this sort of, we're going through this all together and no longer, I mean, we are guests and crew, but in a way we're all on this ship together and we're going to do the best we can. So, all right, Satish, what else do we got?
Yeah, I have a few more, but I wanted to ask my personal question. I was curious on a few things. The command and control center that you showed in your presentation, and you talked about identifying a platform well ahead, right? You mentioned you were using OneDrive or not?
Yes, OneDrive, right.
OneDrive. And you also mentioned that the crisis management team is well prepared with the drills that you conduct and stuff like that. But how much of that is a marketing part of it? Like, marketing team, part of the crisis management drills, and what are the other tools? If you can get into some details, what are the listening stations? How do they look like? What do you listen for? Like your antennas going up, right? What kind of search keywords, for example, on Google search or Twitter, how do you listen to them and things like that? If you could go into detail.
I'll go to a few parts. One, in terms of the emergency response center. So again, that was a public photo covered by a trade. I wasn't trying to show anything proprietary. And really, I would say there's a couple things that you should know. OneDrive we adopted for the rapid communication, the development and approval of communications, right? Whether it's a press statement, to have people review, those things, so that was almost like a side thing that we developed because we had so much communications to get done. The thing that happens in terms of the emergency response center that you saw, people are assigned tasks, right? People are given roles to say, okay, who's the fleet lead, the medical lead, and we have to make sure who is going to be on call given a particular time. So that is all part of it. And there's a system of calling people up. Hey, we have a crisis. You got to come in. So all of that is done ahead of time. I think, again, the difference is we didn't know about the length of it. So we had to go deeper in the bench to say, okay, we got to get coverage for 24/7. Number two, in terms of what is used, the Emergency Response Center does have, and I don't want to get too much into it, but they do have this shared system that everybody can keep track of, a centralized database of here's the situation of what's going on board. So everybody has a central source of information that is fed by all the crisis leaders so that everybody knows, okay, they can log in and look at here's the status of what's going on, right? Parallel to that, from a communication standpoint, we use OneDrive to create those outbound communications, captain announcements, statements, web content that would go up. We pulled that out of that because it was going to be quicker and easier to make sure we all did that through OneDrive. Okay, so that's part one, Satish. And what was your second thing? I don't know what your second question was. I forgot.
No, I'm sure that you identified these platforms well ahead, right? Not.
Yeah, well, the emergency response platform is a platform that was really developed from the ground up. And
how do you conduct the emergency response drills? Like, how do you simulate a situation, or what do you do?
Okay, so the emergency response drills, literally, they try to make it like not everybody knows, and so literally you get a call that says, "Hey, go to the emergency response center," or you know, and everybody does their part. And then there's the communications team. There's someone who goes into the main room, a representative, but we also have separate centers for communicom, separate centers for maybe guest experience, etc. And so I think that you have people who, quite frankly, know where to go. And, and that's practice. Yeah. Okay.
Let me clarify my question. I think I'm trying to piggyback on the earlier question from Carolyn.
Yeah, there's some great comments from Carolyn in the chat there that people should check out. Really interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, because a lot of the news that's reported is based on what you see on Twitter or social media and stuff like that.
Yeah. Hey, can we go to Amy?
Now, for the emergency response team to know that their configurations are working, do you simulate someone posting on Reddit, Twitter, some test hashtags, and see that you're able to capture that? And
so, and I know Tim had done this, but really quickly, Satish, and we'll go to Professor Tim. We brought in a lot of people. We had some agency partners, people who were not in PR social, who helped us monitor social. So we were trying to cover all the social we could across all the countries 24/7 to the extent that we could. So that was something we definitely tried to help stand up. And it was grueling. I will tell you, the social team was very taxed and stretched because there's so many outlets and so many people posting things. It was tough, but I think they did a very incredible job. Professor Tim, you had someone had a comment?
Oh yeah, I had two things, Gordon. One was, so did you have separate agencies you worked with in different countries to monitor the social?
Yeah, so what happened is, a lot of countries don't have huge teams. So literally the people there, whether they were marketing, sales, whatever, they helped monitor social. And we actually had it so that we had a collective document where they would send it into us, to my international marketing lead, for example. We would compile it in our comms lead, and we would be able to look at it. So like at nighttime, when we would get some hours of sleep, they would be looking at what was going on in Asia. We would check in the morning, look at what was relevant, what was topical, and that would help us develop, okay, what work products do we have to do to potentially help maybe our other markets?
Gosh, it's incredibly complicated when you put the global spin on it, because you have passengers on the ship from all over the world.
That's right.
And different countries involved and different teams. Who was it? I think Amy had an interesting question. Amy, what was your question about the future of the industry or something like that?
Yeah, what is the cruise industry offering currently or envisioning in lieu traditional offerings?
Yeah, good question. So I think a lot of companies, like what Princess did, is we started offering Princess at Home. We would start sending content to guests. So for example, we have a sleep doctor, Dr. Michael Bruce. A lot of people maybe have hard times to sleep during the stress. So we started creating video content to our guests to say, hey, here's how you may want to sleep better during this time of crisis. We had our mixologist, Rob Floyd, show people how to make certain cocktails, and we sent that to people. Same with our celebrity chef, Curtis Stone. He helped teach people how to make roast chicken. So we tried to look at our assets. If you can't take a cruise on the ocean, can we bring elements of the cruise to people at home? And actually, there's people who've actually shared with us, hey, I did a virtual cruise at home. Wasn't quite the same, but they tried to simulate the activities based on the tools they had. And I think you find other companies who did variations of it, right, to try to have people, try to keep people happy, et cetera. But, you know, clearly it doesn't replace it. People want to get out, back on a ship, back on the ocean, and hope that happens sooner than later.
Right. What % of the folks who are on this ship do you think will come back eventually for another cruise? If you were just guessing, if you were to say within the next 5 years of the people who went through the experience, what would be your guess? Like what % of them?
I'm not going to guess on. I think, like I said, I think a majority. Okay, that's the number I'll give you. I'm not going to give you a number. I think a majority will come back, a vast majority, just because they love cruising so much. The difference, Tim, might be is when. I think there's going to be some guests that may be more cautious and will wait a little longer than others, but I think the vast majority will come back. It's just going to be timing and their threshold, per se.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the really interesting things in the world right now, which is, I think what's hard right now for brands and for lots of companies going through this, is everyone says, oh yeah, we're going to come back when it's safe, right? But that's a really hard phrase.
It's all relative.
Right? It's like at Kellogg, right? We'll do classes when it's safe. But what does that even mean? Like if you're, how do you operationalize that? I mean, is it perfectly safe? I don't know, because there's lightning. I could get hit by lightning when I walk outside. So if I want to be completely safe, I'm never going to leave my bed. But even that's not safe, you know. But like, what is safe? And I think that's one of the really hard things right now.
Yeah, I can't answer that. I think that's all relative, right? It's like the people right now who are going out to restaurants outdoors, some people won't do that, others will. So I think it's all relative to your own, how you feel. And I think that'll happen with cruising. Although Carolyn or Frenchie, who are entertainment director, she did comment that the guests who all go off the ship, they all said, we're coming back. So in many ways, if you're talking about the Diamond Princess guests or the Grand Princess guests, the guests who have been impacted, I think 99% of them will be coming back to cruise with us. When that is going to be a matter of like when they have vacation. Maybe some of them will feel more safe than others, but they are going to come back.
Right. Well, and a lot of it will be how do things develop in terms of timing with vaccines and treatments and all.
Sure.
And hopefully we'll get our arms around all of this. But in the meantime, it's still a really interesting moment for brands. On a lighter note, hey, Gordon, on a lighter note, you saw Isaac yesterday. You were saying you saw Isaac? Is that right?
For people in the audience who are with us still, people remember the show The Love Boat, one of the top TV series, and you saw Gavin MacLeod and Joe Whelan, 2 cast members from The Love Boat. Isaac was the bartender on Love Boat, and yeah, we shot an interview with Isaac. I mentioned to you our mixologist, Rob Floyd. He's doing an interview show, so we interviewed Isaac because he's the most famous bartender in the world, and we made a drink together. So he's doing great, and and he sends his regards, the 2-fingered point to everybody.
All right, I'm sensitive to time. Hey, Gordon, this has been fabulous. So a couple big takeaways from this. What are a couple of your big takeaways from having been through the whole thing?
I'd say number one, prepare, right? Practice. Luckily we've gone through drills. For those of you who haven't, please try to do that. Number 2 is, like I mentioned also, in terms of the ability to listen to your guests. Social media can be your friend or your enemy, and please make sure you take advantage of it, because if you aren't addressing your customer needs of what they're saying, if you're ignoring them, that's not going to bode well. And I think that's why we ended up in such a positive way. As Frenchie was saying, these guests said, we're going to come back, because I think the crew really listened to them, tried to do what we could to help them. And I think third is really the beyond, making sure you have good communication channels, good listening channels, is the amazing power of the human spirit. I couldn't say beyond the crew who rose up to the challenge, the passengers and guests who supported each other. And I think that one of the things we realized is, as much as we were doing it ourselves, we also embraced the help of others, the outpouring of support with Hang in There, Diamond Princess. whether it's the Torreses or others who cheered people up, helped get care packages. It's amazing in this world. You as a company, as much as you have to take a leadership position, I think in many ways you can also use the consortia of your customers, your fellow passengers, your fellow guests to help you out. And I think they will, because in many ways we all want to get through this together. And that was what struck me, that everybody really wanted to support each other and help each other out. So the power of the human spirit, embrace it, use it to help you. And it really can help you.
I think that is a really sort of a hopeful part of this story in a way. I mean, the pandemic is so hard and we're all struggling through this. And yet at the core, there's a lot that, people will do to help each other. And if you can tap into it, that is great. I mean, personally, that's important, but also I think for brands. And if you're a brand that treats people with respect and empathy and openness, in a way, you can come out almost stronger through this whole experience. And at the end of it, even though we can't do a lot of the stuff we want to do, we can still, though, come out with a stronger brand when we're
right. Exactly.
Hey, Gordon, if people have questions, can they get in touch with you to follow up?
Yeah, they can. I think we put it on the screen afterwards, but they can send an email to me at gordon@expertainment.com. That's an X, not an EX, expertainment.com, or link in with me. LinkedIn is a great tool for everyone. And, we can chat. I'm here. I've said that, it was an exhausting set of weeks for so many people who were involved in the extended Princess family, but it's one of those life-defining moments that I'll never forget. And to the extent that myself, or I'm sure the rest of the team, if we can make things safer or better for others, we want to do it. So
absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Terrific. Right. And if people have any questions for me or want to get in touch, the same. LinkedIn is great. Or you can shoot me an email at t-calkins@northwestern.edu. But this has been so fun. Gordon, thank you for being here. Satish, thank you for the invitation. Bridget, thank you for all the logistics on this stuff. This has been really fun to do. I hope we can do it again fairly soon. And Gordon, I'll be in touch talking about getting you speaking in class maybe this fall at Kellogg. That would be awesome to get you in there. So
it'd be my honor. Thank you. Thanks everybody for hanging out so late. For those of you on the East Coast, and those of you in LA, stay cool. It's a hot one.
There we go. Absolutely.
I have just a few closing comments. I have just a few closing comments.
Oh, sorry, Satish. Yeah. Sorry. Hang tight, people.
For your conversation. It was very engaging, interactive, and introspective. I didn't realize the time passed so quick. We have a little over 220 registrants for this event, who will all be receiving a video to the conversation that we have recorded. A short survey will also be sent out. We appreciate if you can respond. And thanks a lot for taking time out and joining us today. Really appreciate it.
All right, very good. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Cynthia. Thanks, Satish. Thank you, Bridget. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thanks so much. All right, bye-bye.
Nice to see you, Frenchie. Thank you.